Welcome everyone, this is David, and today's video is on the Church Fathers are not Monophysite, rather they are Dyophysite. This is a response to Agin's massive quote mine compilation on the Fathers supposedly teaching one nature. In this video, in this response, I will show that approximately at least 80% of them, a significant portion of the quotations, fall under one of the three categories. One, eisegetical readings of passages, so basically assuming his own worldview, imposing them into the passages and reading them in that light. This should be more simple to demonstrate. The second part, which I will say is very important, is forgeries. He makes use of forgeries. He even defends the forgeries, particularly the Apollinarian forgeries. These were texts that were attributed to various different saints that were actually written by Apollinarius, right? So he argues that they were not actually written by Apollinarius, they were actually written by the very saints that they are attributed to. There's a very good reason why the scholars are united on this point, that those texts were actually written by Apollinarius, and I will demonstrate and prove that to be the case. And lastly, blatant misrepresentation of the fathers. So, out of context quotes, mistranslations, things of that nature. And then concluding the video with a brief, really short Dyophysite florilegium with a surprise argument, basically. So, with that, we can begin. Starting with monophysite eisegesis. Now, there are mainly three types, and a lot of the quotes really, as I said, they're not really problematic for us. They fall under one of the three issues. They speak about a union of nature, so the union language is assumed to be, monophysitic. And then there's a language of mixture, and then there's a language of twofoldness, right? Twofold language also being somehow, one nature language. Now, union language, I will argue, is very typically, the quotes that he uses, they're very broad. I mean, they can be accepted by pretty much anyone that speaks on basic Christology. And I won't make much of a deal of it. Mixture language and twofold language, on the other hand, are actually Dyophysite. And yes, you might be surprised, mixture language. I mean, if anything, mixture language should be monophysite, shouldn't it? Yes, normally it is, but the fathers are employing Stoic mixture language. And Stoic mixture is very different from other kinds of mixture, as we are going to see. And also the language of twofold, which it's applying doubleness to the natures of Christ, obviously Dyophysitic, as I will also show. So let us start with the language, the union language, right? So following John Philoponus, which really before him, following an Apollinarius, he's the one who makes this argument. Monophysites argue that union, because it literally means making one or becoming one, the things united, the elements that are united, if they are truly united, must become one. So this is the basic presupposition. So statements like two natures united, from two natures are one, two natures made one, Christ is one, not two, Christ is not divided into two, do not divide the Christ into two after the union, right? These passages are all eisegetically read as confirming monophysite Christology. But there are very obvious problems with this. Before I move on to the next slide, one main thing about union is that, yes, when there are things that unite, there is a unity. There is something that is a unity. What that unity is, that's a separate question, okay? So the union of two elements does mean there must be something that is united. But does that mean the elements themselves being united are strictly one? I will give two examples for that not being the case. One of them is the marriage argument, and he himself argued, oh, your interpretation of the marriage argument is Nestorian. If anything, his application of the marriage, the state of marriage to Christology, to the extent that he does, is actually what is Nestorian. Because if you look at marriage, right, and this is, Christ says the two become one flesh, right? The two become one in marriage. And what is marriage, right? Husband and wife becoming one spiritual flesh, right? So the elements that are united in marriage are husband and wife. Does that mean that after their marriage, there's one husband-wife? No. There's the spiritual reality, again, of them being one flesh. They are accounted to one another, right? They live one unified spiritual life. That is what marriage is. And so if you notice, again, after marriage, there are still the elements remain. The elements remain distinct. Another example, if there's any example of unity, it will be the Holy Trinity. And Christ in John 10:30 says, I and my Father are one. I and my Father are names for hypostasis. Yet Christ says we are one. Is Christ lying when he says, I and my Father are one? Because there are two hypostases in their unity. So they are one because they have the unity of essence and they're indivisible. But nevertheless, as St. Hilary of Poitiers says, that name which is peculiar to the divine nature is inherent in each. Therefore, the two are one. So there is a unity, that's why they are one. But the elements or the things that are united, do they become one? Not necessarily. Does that mean that they are not united? Does that mean that they are not one? No, it doesn't. So this fallacious argument, I will say, has been demonstrated to be, well, fallacious. Now, let us come to the language of mixture. As I said, the language of mixture in the Fathers, because they used the concept of Stoic mixture, is actually Dyophysite. And this is explicitly Dyophysite, even according to his own terms, as I will show now. But he cites many fathers, such as Saint Irenaeus, and we will move from that, but also other fathers that speak of a blending and a mixture of the natures. So now, of course, if this is applied in a mostly Aristotelian sense, which will mean that the elements do not persist after the union, they change, they get dissolved, etc., then this will be an incorrect application of the Christological union, if not heretical. But this is not what they use, you see. They understand this mixture to be in the sense of Stoic mixture. Now, what exactly is Stoic mixture? Well, my research into it started from this quote. He cited this passage, right? Irenaeus also uses Stoic mixture theory, etc., etc. And I wondered, okay, where is this passage from? I want to read it. And I found the book is Anthony Brigman's God and Christ in Irenaeus. So I read the chapter where he talks about St. Irenaeus' Christology. And I find it really interesting, especially, since as many of you have probably seen the debate, he, asked me about what do you think this scholar said? What do you think that scholar said in the debate? And trying to, I guess, make a point about me disagreeing with them. But this is a scholar that he cites that actually fundamentally disagrees with him. And we will see how. Now, what exactly is Stoic mixture? I've been talking about Stoic mixture so much. What exactly is it? The point of Stoic mixture is not that the elements that are mixed become changed and they get dissolved and confused into one thing. That's not Stoic mixture. Stoic mixture, the main theme is that the elements that are united, one of the elements pervades entirely through the other element, right? That is the main theme of Stoic mixture. So, for example, iron and heat. You have, you can put iron under heat. You can have, an iron sword or whatever, any iron element, and heat will completely pervade all throughout the iron. And yet, both of them retain their substance and their properties. Now, this is not what I'm saying. This is taken from the book, so I'm putting the quotes here. This is not what I'm saying. This is what not only Stoics are saying, but people commentating on Stoic beliefs are also saying. So here you have Alexander of Aphrodisias. I'm not going to read the entire quote, but I will focus on the most important relevant parts. So, for example, Alexander Aphrodisias says that the union in their entirety, the Stoic mixture, in the union of the entirety of their the substances, right, the original substance and qualities in such a mixture remains after the union, right? This is one of the points that is stated. This is also stated by another passage of Alexander of Aphrodisias. The relevant passage before I move on to the other one is that the third type of mixture, he says, so this is Stoic mixture, occurs through certain substances and their qualities being mutually coextended in their entirety and preserving their original substance and qualities in such a mixture, right? Preserving their original substance. Now, in the debate, he stated very clearly that the natures after the union, there's no distinct natures after the union. There's only one nature, so there can't be a distinction. Well, here in Stoic mixture, Alexander of Aphrodisias states to us very clearly, in a Stoic mixture, The elements remain in their original substance and properties distinct after the union. And this is also, this is continued to be stated by him in another passage, and also Arius Didymus. So again, this is actually quite commonly known in the theory of Stoic mixture. Now, Brigman cites Sorabji as a positive witness to make this point further. For the character of the mixture involved, one will expect orthodox believers in two natures to draw on Stoic rather than Aristotelian theory. For the ingredients in the Stoic mixture persist actually, not potentially, and one can be dominant as the divine nature was supposed to be without obliterating the other. And Brigman himself states in various different places that, in the resultant from the blending, the original substances and qualities proper to each of the constituent ingredients persist. Right. In another page, he says the union then between human beings and the divine word does not jeopardize their distinction. They remain different in kind and always distinguishable when united. And again, he states, as I've stated several times now, the Stoics believe that blending produces a union in which the original substances and qualities proper to each of the constituent ingredients persist and the qualities of each show forth. And finally, in the final sentence, he says, incorporating Stoic mixture theory then enables Irenaeus, and I add other fathers, to affirm at one and the same time the distinction of the two natures and their unity. Again, he cited this book, not me. I'm not originally citing this book. He cited this book. I agree with Anthony Brigman. I don't agree with everything he says in the book, but I do agree insofar as the way he describes Stoic mixture. And if he doesn't agree with it, well, he should give us reasons why. Because as I stated, what Anthony Brigman is saying is not just his own scholarly opinion. It is also what, as I've previously shown, the opinions of other Greek scholars, other Greek philosophers commentating on Stoic mixture. Okay? So I think that makes it very clear that Stoic mixture is inherently Dyophysite. Now, let us finally move to twofold nature. We have the Greek term diplos and other many different Greek terms as well, like ditos, etc. And geminae in Latin, which means twofold. And so the argument goes, well, they modify a singular noun in the sense of, when speaking about nature. And since they modify a singular noun, well, it must therefore mean that there is one nature with, that is from two natures. Does Severus think that this is canonically the case, that twofold, that's referring to Christ as twofold or a twin nature, is orthodox? Actually, Severus himself says no. Now, Severus's argument regarding the passages where Christ is stated as twofold, he argues that when the fathers say Christ is twofold, and he gives examples of Saint Gregory the Theologian and Saint John Chrysostom, when they say Christ is twofold, what they actually mean is that, well, Christ is twofold, meaning that he's from two natures and his twofoldness is contemplative, which, these are kind of ad hoc defenses. And in the texts that I will also, show, that is not, those qualifications are not mentioned in the text themselves. So Christ is stated as being twofold without those qualifications. So that's one thing to note. As you can see in this passage, Severus himself states very clearly, none of the fathers, nor of the divinely inspired doctors declared Christ to be twofold. So he ultimately rejects twofold. He says Christ is not twofold. And obviously, he will reject it because twofold, whether you imply two-ness grammatically in the noun, or whether you modify it by an adjective or whatever, two-ness implies division in Severus's thought, right? If there's two-ness within the one substance, well, that means there's a duality, there's a separation within the one substance. So how can there be unity where there's separation? Logically speaking, that's where that logic will go. So just on that front, twofold is absolutely not a quote Miaphysite term, even like normal Miaphysite term. It is not part of it, right? And Severus's arguments are not really good, as we shall see. But in terms of the fact that twofold can mean two, I will show Saint Cyril here. He says that nature of our negligence will not be understood as one and the same, but rather as twofold and different, right? So there are two natures of our negligence that he's talking about. Of course, talking about nature in different sense here, not Christologically. Then we have Saint Epiphanius, who says that God is a threefold hypostasis. Now, A couple of pages later, he says God is three hypostases in one ousia. Okay, so here he is using hypostasis in the sense of person. He says hypostasis, the threefold hypostasis. Notice hypostasios, that is the genitive singular. It's singular. It's not plural. It's not hypostasis in the plural. Well, that's a singular noun. Does that mean that God is one hypostasis? Absolutely not. Means he's basically saying that there are three hypostases in the Trinity. Saint Gregory of Nyssa states that Eunomius believes in a God that has two natures, not Christologically, of course, but in his own essence. He says that Eunomius' God is a being with double nature or composite, right? Well, however he likes to state. And then we have St. John Chrysostom. So Severus quotes St. John, who says, "For this human life is twofold, since it is compounded out of two substances." So he uses this citation to argue that, look, St. John Chrysostom says Christ is from two natures. And from two natures means there's one nature afterwards. So he's actually saying one nature, right? This is basically Severus's argument in this passage. So the assumption is that from two natures means strictly one. But this is an assumption St. John Chrysostom himself does not believe. Now, those who remember the debate will remember I mentioned a specific passage from St. John Chrysostom where he speaks of human nature as two natures or two substances. I didn't remember the exact passage off the top of my head because I couldn't. He thought it was funny, which I suppose you're abnormal if you don't remember every single passage, every single quote in your mind. So if you're busy reading books. But this is the passage that I was talking about, the 29th homily on Matthew. And St. John Chrysostom, regarding the healing of the paralytic, which last Sunday was the Sunday of the paralytic, right? So this is what he's talking about. He says, "Seest thou how he indicates him to be creator both of souls and bodies? He heals therefore the palsy in each of the substances." Now, someone might be super excited and say, well, the word two isn't here. Okay. But the word ousias is here. Ousias, that is the accusative, that is the feminine accusative plural. So it indicates that there's more than one nature here. This is a plural, right? Tas ousias, that will be ousias with the article. So yeah, he might not say two, but he is saying substances. He's speaking about substances in the plural. So nevertheless, two is implied here very clearly. And then we have passages of twofoldness in the Greek fathers. So this is St. Gregory the Theologian. Now, prior to saying that Christ is twofold, he says that my God, right, is used not of the word. So the word doesn't say my God, but the visible one, right? It says visible word here in English, but in Greek it's, the one, the seen one, right? Nevertheless, it's not the word, but the seen one that is saying this. This language is not acceptable in, quote Dyophysite taught. And again, our Lord was twofold, right? He states that Christ was twofold. This is stated also by St. Cyril of Jerusalem, that the Christ was twofold. Man in what was seen, but God in what was not seen. As man truly eating like us, for he had the like feeling of the flesh with us, but as God feeding the 5,000 from 5 loaves, as man truly dying, but as God raising him that had been dead 4 days, truly sleeping in the ship as man, and walking upon the waters as God, right? Now, let's get to the passages of twofold within the Latin tradition, particularly the interpretation of Psalm 19:5, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoices as a giant. The KJV says strong man, but the Latin text is gigantes, right? A giant. I think also the Greek text too, as a giant to run a race. Now, in Christological application, this is again used a lot by the Western Fathers. The way they interpret this passage is that some indicate that the bridegroom indicates the humanity, the giant indicates his divinity because of the implication of strength. Some state that the giant itself indicates a twofold substance, a twofold nature. Now, in terms of interpreting what this means, he cites Warren Smith, who claims that Saint Ambrose is speaking of a singular twofold nature, in the case that as exemplifying the giant, right? Because the giants that we're speaking about, particularly as the Latin tradition understood, and I think this is the case, were demon-human hybrids, right? They were angelic by nature; they were fallen angels. They were also human. So these giants are a compound nature of angels and humans. And so in this sense, well, okay, if giants are a compound nature, then it is applied to Christ, then Christ is a compound nature. We will see that this is not how St. Ambrose is applied. That is, Warren Smith is wrong, and Aegon is wrong. So, first of all, St. Augustine, which Aegon himself admits is Dyophysite, states that Christ is a twin substance giant, right? So he understands twin substance to mean two substances. Further on, let's look at St. Ambrose himself. Again, look, he's talking about St. Ambrose. So let's look at St. Ambrose applying the text giant of salvation. So he talks about Christ has fulfilled as the giant of salvation the verity of the one Son of God. How? Let's read the passage very carefully. For he who as Almighty is born from the Almighty, as Redeemer is born of the Virgin, being the same in the diversity of his two divisible natures. Right, the Latin passage is here, so you can see for yourself. So he is interpreting Christ being the giant as him being two natures, very clearly and very explicitly. Should I trust what St. Ambrose says, or should I trust what Warren Smith says? What do you say, guys? Let's move on. Further, again, talking about this passage, let's look at, I guess I shouldn't have added this part here, but let's move to the next, I will say, huge mistake that he makes, and that is his interpretation of Uterque. Now, he tries to argue that Uterque it is like, Juris Utriusque Doctor, like the doctor of both laws. And so it's kind of like, you have two laws and they result in one doctorate, being resulted of two laws. So this is kind of so his logic essentially is, this basically is from two natures. This kind of language is from two natures. That is not true. Uterque primarily means each. And I will expand more on that, but let's first look at kind of like what he's appealing to. So there's this concept called doctor of both laws, which is kind of like, more of a medieval and, early modern time era thing, which was given to people who were qualified in canon law, right? Ecclesiastical canon law and civil law, right? And so you will be doctor of both laws. More properly, doctor of each law, right? That's what Doctor Juris Utriusque literally means, okay? Now, he gives the example of one doctorate resulting from two laws. Now, his Christological model is that there's a union of two particular natures that make one particular nature. So all three of these things, conceptually speaking, are the same category of things, okay? So it will be more accurate if this was two laws becoming one law, but that is not what's happening, right? These are two laws existing in one doctorate. So you as a doctor are qualified in both of these laws. Are these laws still two after your qualification of them? Are these laws still two or are they not? If they're two, then this very example that he uses is Dyophysite. The quote he uses again, law and the nations, the building of both. It's not as if there are two buildings that make up one building. It's there are two aspects in one building. But let's move further on, because using this, he even goes, we go to an even worse direction with this in the coming passages. But let's first understand Uterque. And for those who might be confused, he says Utriusque, you say Uterque. Utriusque is the genitive of Uterque, right? It's just a different form of the same word. So Uterque, Utriusque, they're the same word. Utriusque just is the genitive form, Uterque is the nominative form. So this is the Oxford Latin Dictionary. And to also confirm this, I also asked Ubi Petrus, an actual Latin speaker, and they both agree that Uterque means each of the two. This is the primary meaning, each of the two regarded severally. Now, there's a very slight difference between the terms both and each. With both, you can kind of use it to state as if like you're bundling two units together, speaking of them as one unit, right? It doesn't mean that's its primary meaning, but it can have that meaning. Each, however, does not have that meaning. You're considering the things each mentally, individually, right? But you're still treating them as individual things, right? You're still speaking of each thing individually. That means you're treating them as distinct units. So if you treat natures as those things, by themselves, you are speaking of two natures, at least, right? Each nature is basically two natures. Now, if you want to look at the other definitions, I also put it here. You can look at the pages, you can look at the dictionary yourself. Basically means each of the two things, each person or thing of two, each of the two groups, or each of the two reciprocally. So let us look at how he understands this term. And we have some blatant mistranslation. I mean, I will put this in the blatant misrepresentation of the Father's point, but because this is so connected with what I'm talking about right now, I decided I'll just rather put it here. So here he translates the Expositione Epistola Timotheum, and the key passage here is, according to his translation, Saint Hilary supposedly says, and there may be between man and God a mediator, confessing in himself the nature that is of both. Now, think of this in English, right? The nature that is of both. The nature is nominative here, right? So you will expect that to be the case in the Latin, but no. Even here, as provided, utriesque naturae, right? Natura is nominative, but naturae, the e ending, that makes it genitive. So if you look at it, and this is one of the few things that ChatGPT is good at is actually translating, and maybe he should have used that instead of, I don't know what he did when he translated that passage, but more properly speaking, Saint Hilary is saying, for where Christ is man, he stands forth as the mediator of God and man, so that from both God and man one may subsist, and that he may be a middle one between man and God by the confession in himself, by the confession in himself of each nature. He's speaking about two natures here, two natures being confessed in himself. This is quite literally the acknowledged in two natures of the Council of Chalcedon. And again, utriesque naturae, both are in genitive singular. So I don't know where he got this translation from, but he should get his money back. That's the nicest way I will say it. Let's look at the other instance, right? And because through these higher things he preached about the nature in which he existed. Again, the nature in which he existed. But if you look at the Latin passage, this is not what he's saying. I even went to ask Ubi Petrus about this, and this is how he translated this. He preached out of each type or genus of nature in which he was separately. Each type of nature in which he was separately, of God, of course, and of man. And in Latin, discretum ex utroque, right? Out of each type, in quo erat naturae, genere predicavit. So that's it, right? In quo, in which he was in the nature of, of each type, basically, like quite literally. Essentially, in short, as you can read from the passage, Saint Hilary is once again teaching two natures, that there are two natures in Christ. Now, I'm citing Saint Vincent here to just show that Uterque is understood as two substances, because Saint Vincent attacks Apollinarians for not teaching that there are two natures in Christ, for rejecting that there are two substances in Christ. So here, the two substances is translated as, each utriesque, so more probably it's each substance. But if you look at other passages, you see Saint Vincent explicitly talking about, duas substantias, right? So he speaks of, two substances in Christ. And at Apollinarius, because he refuses two substances in Christ, he is, ultimately heterodox. But Christ is two substances, but one person, right? Sed duas substantias, sed unam credit esse personam, duas substantias quae mutabile non est verbum Dei, ut ipsum verteritur in carnem. I hope my pronunciation was not bad, but basically, what I'm getting at here, if you're a little confused at what's going on, is that Saint Vincent treats, uterque or utriesque to be identical with dua, with two, as it literally is, per the Oxford Dictionary of Latin. So let us now move on to a very important part of the video, the forgeries that Egan uses. Now we will start with the most important ones, the Apollinarian Forgeries. So for those who don't know, Apollinarius is a heretic that denied Christ having a human mind. Right? So this is Apollinarius' main heresy. But he also had various different Christological ideas backing that up. He's the originator of at least the Christological usage of the Miaphysis formula. That really, the one incarnate nature formula really originates with him. And as you can see, these fathers, Saints Gregory, Thaumaturgus, Pope Julius, and Athanasius, the writings of Apollinarius, some of the writings of Apollinarius were attributed to these, fathers, to these figures, by, most probably, 99% by his own followers. So Egan believes that in these texts, there are evidences that the doctrine is not Apollinarian, and also that there are some, Orthodox figures that say that the author of these is not Apollinarius, but some other people. But we are going to, again, look. There's a very good reason why scholarship agrees that these texts are Apollinarian. Before I move on, just very brief note, very importantly, is Leontius of Byzantium's work against the frauds of the Apollinarians. He discovers an intra-Apollinarian dispute regarding the consubstantiality of Christ. So you had Apollinarians who, said Christ is consubstantial with human beings, and then you had Proto-Eutychians that denied even that. So within this debate, within these texts, he found out that quotes attributed to, Saint Gregory Thaumaturgus and Saint Pope Julius were utilized, but they were cited under the name of Apollinarius. Now, again, this dispute most likely happened in the late 4th, early 5th century, and I think the latest Apollinarian synod was all the way in the 420s, at the very least in the Middle East. So afterwards, their effect pretty much, they were pretty much left weakened. But nevertheless, these works that Leontius of Byzantium uncovered prove that some of these texts were written by Apollinarius. Now, this is not the only evidence. This is what I wanted to start with. Some of the arguments that Apollinarius makes, which is why he's important to explain and understand in terms of his influence of Miaphysite terminology that occurred. For example, union means there cannot be two. This is an argument made by his student Polemon. Then there's the argument that Christ cannot be one person if he is in two natures. This is an argument that Apollinarius explicitly makes. He says, those who say Christ is one and allege that his two natures have minds and are self-complete do not know him as the Word which became flesh. And I believe there's another fragment where he attacks even like the Cappadocians and Athanasius for believing this. Or it's possible that it was Polemon. It was probably Polemon who made that argument. Anyways, then we have fragment 150. Christ is not double-minded. That is, Christ does not have two wills. He doesn't have two minds. He doesn't have two wills, right? And let us start with pseudo Gregory Thaumaturgus's Katameros Pistis, also known as sectional confession of faith or confession of faith in parts, or however you want to translate it in English. Again, I will state the Greek term, the Greek name Katameros Pistis, right? Now, Saint Gregory Thaumaturgus is a 3rd century church father. This work is like 30%, 40% is on Christology, which is very unusual for a 3rd century text. There are Christological statements, there are Christological arguments that are made, but this, sectional confession of faith, a lot of it is on Christology. Moreover, a lot of it is also on Trinity and is very Nicene, which you will think such a document will be incredibly important and will be circulated a lot more if it truly was written by St. Gregory, but it was not. In fact, there's no mention of this work. St. Gregory of Nyssa mentions a confession of faith attributed to St. Gregory Thaumaturgus in his encomium on Gregory Thaumaturgus. It's not this one. It's a very short one. It's like less than half of what like the Nicene Creed is. It's a very short confession of faith. It's a good one, of course. It's a very valuable one. This is why it was preserved by Saint Gregory of Nyssa. But it's a very short one, and it is not this. It's not this text, and it's not a quotation of this text either. There's no mention of this work until Theodoret cites it in his Eranistes, and until Eutychus's Florilegium, which appears for the first time in his appeal to Pope Saint Leo. Now, in Theodoret, he cites it as a positive witness, but he does not cite it as Gregory Thaumaturgus. He cites it as Apollinarius. Now, this is important because this is not just Theodoret having an opinion on who may be the real author. There wasn't any dispute on who the author was at his time, if I remember correctly, or if there was, we don't really have any records of it. But Theodoret is someone who has documents and writings of Apollinarius, because as he states in his own church history, The last of the Apollinarian Synod, I think between 410 and 420, they joined to the Antiochian Church, right? Now, when you have a synod joining back to the church, their library also joins the church, right? And so it's left up to the church on deciding, okay, what are we going to do with these documents? Are we going to burn them? Are we going to do, what are we going to research? What are we going to do? Theodoret, so there's a very realistic line of descent of the documents from the Apollinarians to Theodoret, right? So he's not just someone who has an opinion, he's a very likely candidate and attestation of this document. Again, this is a minor argument, by the way. We haven't even gone to the major arguments yet. This language is similar to Apollinarian works, which I haven't noted much, but just wanted to state in Casparis Alto Neue Quelle. And also, Leontius Byzantium states that Apollinarians themselves attribute this work to Apollinarius. So we have Theodoret and Apollinarius themselves attributing this to Apollinarius. It's for the first time attributed to St. Gregory Thaumaturgus by Eutyches in written record. And these are this is the work of against the frauds of the Apollinarians of Leontius of Byzantium. So just putting them here for you to see. Now, his main argument. Now, this text is important because, again, states very clearly that Christ is not two natures, right? Now, Agon argues the passage I outlined with red that we are going to be analyzing. He argues that this is proof that the text is not of Apollinarian origin. Why? Well, because according to his translation, spoiler alert, it is completely wrong, and we're going to look at that. But according to his translation, it states that God has the sufferings of soul and flesh undefeated. And remember, according to Apollinarius, Christ does not have a human mind. In early stages, it means that he did not have a soul. So he cannot have the sufferings of soul. So there are two problems with this. Number one, Apollinarius began with a dichotomous model, but eventually had a trichotomous model, and especially this is clear in St. Gregory of Nyssa's anti-Apollinarian writings. So trichotomous meaning for normally, canonically speaking, in Orthodox anthropology, man is a body and soul. Apollinarius at some point argued that man is a body and a soul, but an irrational soul and a rational soul, that is the mind, right? So there is that point that also has to be considered. It's a minor point. Before we get to the translation, the mistranslation, the other point is that, assuming this is true, Apollinarianism, both Apollinarius himself and his disciples, at some point, in order to deceive people into making them think that they are Orthodox, started to use certain Orthodox phraseologies like Christ is completely man. But, and in this case, Saint Epiphanius gives evidence that, Vitalis, who's an Apollinarian, says Christ was a perfect man, but he didn't have a mind. But we say he is perfect because instead of the mind, he has the divinity. This is the same argument Apollinarius makes in Ad Episcopos Diocaesiensis. So again, we know this is from Apollinarius. And Apollinarius says that, again, Christ is, perfect and perfectly man. And he even says, therefore, the Savior also did not have a body which was soulless, senseless, or mindless. So he says, Christ didn't have a mindless body because his mind was a divine nature. And very importantly, he says, and keep this in mind because we're going to get back to this. He states, it is complete with respect to a divine completeness and not a human one. Now, let us look at the passage that he says, that he says is proving his passage. So again, the passage on the right is the passage in Greek. Nous aetitos on, this is the nominative. So the sentence is divided into two, right? Nominative part and the genitive part, right? So nous is mind, aetitos is unconquered, on is being, right? So mind, unconquered being, right? We're going literal, right? So so for now, no regard for word order. We're just going for a very basic translation. So basically, the subject of this passage is the divine mind, unconquered being. And then there's a genitive. So what is this of? Ton psychikon ke sarkikon patimaton. So of soul-related and bodily or body-related passions. right? So when we combine these two things and we have a bit more of a idiomatic translation, we get this as a result. Of course, the subject is God. God being an unconquered mind over the soul-related and bodily passions. This is what the passage idiomatically states. So he is not stating that Christ has, sufferings of the soul and flesh undefeated. He's saying that he doesn't have the passions of the body and the soul at all, because he's talking about the divine mind. Has no passions of that. If anything, this is proof that the text is Apollinarian, because he's only talking about the divine mind. He's not talking about a human mind or a human soul in Christ. Another passage, which I asked you to remember a passage. We're going back to that. He says, "And the one without flesh who appeared in the flesh is true God, whole with respect to the true and divine wholeness." Where is the mention of human wholeness? Absolutely not. Again, in the Greek, telios ti alithini keteia teliotiti. But nothing afterwards, right? It's just God, Christ is only divinely whole. Well, look at the passage, what he says in Ad Episcopos Diokaiseriensis. It is complete with respect to a divine completeness and not a human one. This is a classically Apollinarian phrase. So we have seen so far, this is clearly a work of Apollinarius. If you want more evidence of what Apollinarianism is and how this relates, here's St. Cyril of Alexandria. The Apollinarians attribute the activity of the intellect and the soul to the only begotten. He says the same exact statement in On Orthodoxy to Theodosius. So this is how St. Cyril defines Apollinarianism, attributing the activity of mind and soul to the word alone, right? To the word alone being to the divinity, right? Not to a separate subject, obviously. Now, let us move on to the works of Pseudo Julius, right? So Pope Saint Julius was the Pope of Rome, I believe, in the middle 4th century. So he was a contemporary figure with Apollinarius, if I remember correctly. And the last scholarly work on Saint Julius's works is Thompson's Correspondences of Pope Julius I. He views these works, and there's like 7 letters attributed to him that is of Apollinarian origin. He views all of them as Apollinarian forgeries, basically. These works are all Apollinarian forgeries. So this is the updated scholarly view. Now, we're going to focus on the 3 works, De Unione, De Fide et Incarnatione, and Ad Dionysium, starting with De Unione. So he cites this passage, okay? Now, you don't want to cite De Unione at all. You don't want to cite it. And I know, St. Cyril is citing, De Unione, he's citing this as well. First of all, again, this is, the Apollinarians admit that this is from Apollinarius. But what's even worse is that the teaching of De Unione is so obviously Apollinarian. The author says, "For in this way he gave life to the body by the sanctification of the deity and the dwelling of not a human soul. Ke uk anthropinis psychis kataskevi." Right? The dwelling of not a human soul. Right? So Christ does not have... Okay, the author literally says Christ does not have a human soul. So I think it's quite clear who is the author of this work. And he even, the author even, goes on to explain why that is the case. Because normal human beings receive the soul because they are, they come from their father's sperm. They're their father's sperm. And that's where you get your soul from. That's basically his approach. But he argues that, well, in the case of Christ, since he is not, he did not come about from a sperm, he's not contrived from a sperm, there's no spermatic fluid, so there is no soul, right? Now, he cites this to those contending the incarnation, which De Fide et Incarnatione, right? So this is the passage that, as you can see, his rationally ensouled flesh. So this is used as, look, this proves that the author is not Apollinarius. As I stated, doesn't really prove anything, even if this is not a forged passage, because as I've shown, Vitalius and Apollinarius, they started to use orthodox phraseology to deceive people, as St. Gregory the Theologian says. But bad news, this is a forged passage. This does not exist in the earliest manuscripts. And Lietzmann, who's basically the scholar on this issue, says this was an interpolation. And most importantly, why do we know that this is missing in the earliest manuscripts? Because the earliest manuscript is Eutychus's, quote, patristic dossier. This statement is not in Eutychus's dossier. Okay, it does not exist there. So this passage is clearly a forged passage to make it look like St. Julius said this. Now, there's another problem as well. The author complains about being accused, him and his synod being accused of saying that the flesh of the humanity of Christ is from heaven. Now, Saint Julius is never accused of this. If he is, we don't have any records of it. There's no records of Saint Julius, Pope Saint Julius being accused of this. But we have many records of someone being accused of this. Do you want to guess who that person is? Apollinarius. Saint Gregory the Theologian, letter 101, says, if anyone assert that his flesh came down from heaven, blah, 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 let him be anathema. And in Saint Gregory of Nyssa, there's so many instances, I didn't want to just quote every single one of them. So I just quoted only one of them. But throughout the text, he basically attacks Apollinarius for claiming that the humanity of Christ was from heaven, not from the Virgin Mary. So this is a very common accusation against Apollinarius. And here, the author is complaining about that accusation. Again, we don't have any records of Pope St. Julius being accused of this, but we have many records of Apollinarius being accused of this doctrine. So, with this, we can see very clearly, De Fide et Incarnatione, clearly a work of Apollinarius. Now, the other text, Ad Dionysium, where there's also, again, Monophysite terminology, right? Quote, Miaphysite terminology. And we have, again, Leontius of Byzantium saying that this is a forgery. And then we have also the same complaint about claiming that the flesh is from heaven. Again, if popes, we will expect there being records of this accusation, because it seems like, Julius is really being accused of the same thing over and over again. He has to state this all throughout his various different letters. It's almost as if he's constantly being accused of believing a doctrine that the Apollinarians, which he lived contemporaneously, also believed. Or this was written by Apollinarius. And here we have Pseudo Julius saying that the body is not life-giving. Now, here, if he's only talking about the body, then he hasn't talked about the soul at all, right? So if he's talking about the body to mean exclusively the body throughout this work, then since there's no mention of soul, we will expect there being a mention of a soul or ensouled body from an Orthodox author. But this does not exist in this text. If body here means human nature in general, then he denies a spiritual activity of the body, because he says it neither gives life by itself. Now, I understand that people are going to argue, no, he's talking about self. No, he's talking about the activity of the soul being, giving life like the soul does in all of us, right? The soul is the life force in all human beings. It's the life force in all human beings. If you have a soul, it by nature is active. It has a life force. So if you're human by nature, you have this life force. But he says Christ did not have this life force. That's a rejection of Christ having a soul. And finally, Pseudo Athanasius. Now, there are 3 letters that are being claimed to be the letter to Jovian, right? So the main accusation is Saint Athanasius wrote a letter to Emperor Jovian. So Emperor Jovian was an emperor of the Roman Empire for a very short time, like less than a year. And I don't think he even made it to the capital at all at any point. So he had a very short rule, but he had a very significant rule because he reinstated Saint Athanasius back to Alexandria. So he's a very important figure because of that. Now, there are 3 letters contesting, and only one of them can be true, by the way. These are not like missing parts of a greater letter. Only one of these letters can be true. Okay? That's also an important part. Now, we have letter 56, and this is the genuine letter to Jovian. We know this because this letter and its contents and what happened afterwards, it is attested by various different church historians. I think Theodoret gives a copy of just writes, copies the letter. Saint Gregory the Theologian actually talks the most about its history, and he basically says this was about the consubstantiality of the Trinity. This was about defending the Trinity, defending the Council of Nicaea. It was against the Arians, and the emperor, listening to him, did what was needed with Athanasius, which was, accepting his position as the bishop, as the archbishop, as the patriarch of Alexandria, right? And again, the other church historians also verify these facts. So we have a massive narrative about this letter, about the genuinity of this letter. Now, then we have two contesting letters. I will state, the letter to Jovian and then the letter to Jovinian, right? Now, actually, they're kind of basically the same name, but the letter to Jovinian, it's the name of it in Patrologia Graeca. So there are two distinct letters, but the one that is mostly associated with Apollinarius is the letter to Jovian. Now, most likely, letter to Jovinian was also written by an Apollinarian or by Apollinarius himself. Maybe it was a second letter of Apollinarius. We don't know. But what is interesting about these letters, there's no mention of Trinity. There's no mention of Nicaea. It uses hypostasis in a sense that will not be acceptable to Saint Athanasius, especially in the letter to Jovinian. And with the original letter, what we saw is that, well, it was about the Trinity. Why? Because the problem was Arians, because Saint Athanasius was disposed from his see. So obviously he will talk about the Trinity. He will defend the Council of Nicaea. He will ask the emperor, you need to maintain the acceptance, the canonicity of the Council of Nicaea. That's your job. So letter 56 just simply makes sense. But the other letters, making no mention of Trinity, making no mention of Christology, letters of Jovinian making no mention of Nicaea Trinity, and even going as far as to use hypostasis in a non-Athanasian sense, as I will show, are clear evidences of the non-Athanasian origin of these letters. Now, both the letter to Jovinian and the so-called letter to Jovian, again, both are written, not written by Saint Athanasius, states that Christ is not two natures, but one nature. And the letter to Jovinian says one nature and hypostasis, right? Now, in the letter to Jovinian, it states that the flesh is natural, right? Is rational, right? As an evidence that this is not written by Apollinarius. As I've shown, this is not a good argument, but he's saying that this is this was transmitted under Athanasius' name, and of course his argument is that, well, Saint John Damascus and all of these other Orthodox figures, they said that this letter was by Athanasius. They were wrong. They were not correct. They had a wrong opinion about a letter, and they thought it could be interpreted in an Orthodox way, but they were unaware that the letter was actually written by Apollinarius. Now, when you state this, it's like, oh, you deny your own fathers or anything, which is kind of ridiculous. But they were simply not. They were simply people who had an opinion about a document. It's like, let's say you write a document yourself. Let's say you write an article. You're a ghostwriter, but it's published under someone else's name, and everyone thinks that he published it, and everyone is evidence. And everyone says, okay, yeah, this person X published this amazing article. But and a few other people know, that it was you who actually wrote the whole thing. So if you went to 100 years after, and there's a dispute regarding the authenticity of the article, will we say, well, I mean, it has to be written by person X because everyone attests to it, everyone says he wrote it? That's just an opinion, right? It's just stating an opinion of this person. But for example, if we have someone like Theodoret, who actually has access to the documents, then that's not an opinion. That is someone who has access to the documents and attests to whoever wrote the said document. Anyways, to go back to this point, first of all, Ming says this was clearly not written by Athanasius. It does not represent his style at all. But more importantly, and I will say the most explicit reason why this is not written by Saint Athanasius is that it uses hypostasis in a sense that Athanasius will not accept it. So here it says both his nature and hypostasis incarnate, completely having become man, right? So here hypostasis is kind of being used in a particular sense, but in the 335 version of the Nicene Creed, states that whoever asserts that the Son is of a different hypostasis of the Father is anathema. And Saint Athanasius in fact says on the synods of Arminium in Italy and Seleucia in Isauria, which by the way, those synods are, semi-Arian synods, right? So they were, I believe both of them were composed of actual Orthodox bishops who were forced to accept semi-Arianism. That was kind of basically what happened, or at least one of them was like this. But anyways, regardless, Saint Athanasius in this letter says, and in what scripture did they on their part find unoriginate and the term essence, and there are three subsistences? Where do they find this, right? Basically, what he's basically saying is that where is three hypostasis in scriptures? Where is three hypostasis in the teachings of the church? He's rejecting three hypostasis because for him, three hypostasis means three essences. Three essences means, well, non-consubstantiality. And if there's any doubts about the meaning of the passage, the following passage, St. Athanasius says, where did they find the statement, Christ is not true God? So he's using three hypostasis as a negative belief, not a positive, not something that people should believe. And there's also the other passage, which is according to only the flesh, which is from Mary, he is a man, but according to spirit, the same one is Son of God and God. So I'm pointing this because, of course, people may argue that your flesh means human nature in Athanasius, but in a text like this where it is not mentioned at all, and this is kind of, again, just an assumption, it is, I will say, a minor evidence that supports the fact that this is written by Apollinarius. And moving on with the main evidences. So let's look at his evidences. So St. John Damascus and St. Ephraim of Emid and some random Latin guy from the 6th century thinks they are authentic. That is basically the only evidence. And the other evidence is, well, the internal text shows that they're not Apollinarian, but we just refuted all of them. So the only argument that remains is just appeal to authority. And again, if you think it's problematic that I'm saying the saints were wrong in attributing the identity of the person who wrote this, then I don't know what to tell you, because the saints were never supposed to be historically infallible. They are infallible together in unison when they're preaching doctrine. So that is that. In terms of evidence for them being Apollinarian forgeries, well, there are many. Texts match the literary style of other Apollinarian fragments. I didn't even discuss this, but there are various different examples of this. There's a clear Apollinarian doctrine in many of the works within the texts themselves that are cited. We have testimonies that are authoritative, like Leontius of Byzantium, who produces a inter-Apollinarian dispute, or Theodoret, who cites a document from Apollinarius, right, from the writings of Apollinarius himself. There's no mention or citation of the attribute writings until Uterque is together. Used them in his appeal to Pope St. Leo. Prior to that, we see, St. Cyril of Alexandria coming into contact with Pseudo-Athanasius. So he cites Pseudo-Athanasius' letter to Jovian. And he cites also, I believe, Ad Prostocium, and this is even cited in the Council of Ephesus. So one of the Apollinarian forgeries even made it to the Council of Ephesus, but it didn't have any Apollinarian teaching in it. So it wasn't necessarily problematic. But it still made it into the Council of Ephesus. So, conclusion, there's a very good reason why scholarship agrees they are forgeries, for the exact reasons and more that I have shown here. Now, next part that I want to discuss is the part about Saint Simeon the Stylite. So he believes Saint Simeon was an anti-Chalcedonian because there are two letters, the letter to Mar Jakub of Kafra and the letter to Emperor Leo, condemning the Council of Chalcedon. So let us first talk about the history and then the letters that he claims to be written by Saint Simeon himself. Now, first of all, in terms of his, the historical life that we know of from the main sources, putting aside the letters for a second for a good reason, is that he's not only a Chalcedonian, he was a friend of the Antiochian theologians of his day. So Saint Simeon the Stylite lived at the time of the Council of Chalcedon and he died in 457. So he knew of the Council of Chalcedon, and he was a recipient. I think he died in 459 rather, not in 457. Nevertheless, he lived through those times. He was friends with, for example, Theodoret. Right? Theodoret even wrote about the life of Saint Simeon the Stylite in his history, and the important part where Saint Simeon becomes relevant is in 457. Saint Marcion, Emperor Marcion, dies, and we have a new emperor, Emperor Leo. In 457, he notices that there's a significant issue, most notably in Alexandria. So in Alexandria, Saint Proterius gets murdered, and in 454, while Saint Proterius was the Patriarch of Alexandria, Timothy Aelurus, upon Dioscorus' death, made himself Bishop of Alexandria, right? He basically ordained himself as bishop in secret, uncanonically, etc., etc. And he basically said, no, I'm the real Bishop of Alexandria. Proterius is the fake one. But obviously, Proterius was elected by a synod of bishops, right? And he was elected, legitimately. And Dioscorus was kicked out of the church, also deposed, legitimately. But that's a different debate. Basically, there was this situation at hand, right? With St. Proterius' death, Emperor Leo wanted to ask two things from the people that he circulated this letter to. Number one, what do we think about the Council of Chalcedon? Okay, do we think it's an Orthodox council? Do we accept it? Number two, what do we do with Timothy Aelurus? Is he a bishop of Alexandria? Should we keep him, or should we get rid of him and because he's not a bishop, and should we get an actual bishop in Alexandria? Now, this is the narrative that Evagrius Scholasticus explains. This narrative is accepted by the Monophysite historian Zechariah Mytilene. Okay, and this is also part of the narrative of the very letters that he himself cites, right? The so-called letter to Emperor, Leo, and letter to Mar Jacob of Khafra, right? So both narratives, both the Orthodox narrative and the Monophysite narrative, state that this is something that happened, right? Emperor Leo asked bishops on their opinion on the council. Moreover, we also know that according to, again, both the narrative presented in the letter to Mar Jacob of Khafra, letter to Emperor Leo, and the Orthodox narrative, that Saint Simeon was one of the recipients of the letter. We also know this 100%, right? Both sides agree on this, right? And we also know from Evagrius and Zechariah Mytilene that everyone except for Amphilochius of Sida accepted the Council of Chalcedon. Evagrius says this, Zechariah says this. So now Zechariah does not necessarily state that Saint Simeon was a recipient of the letter, but the supposed letters of Saint Simeon does indeed say basically, I received your letter and now I'm responding to you that I reject the Council of Chalcedon, basically. So both narratives accept the following. Emperor Leo circulated letters, Saint Simeon received the letter, only Amphilochius rejected Chalcedon. But even Amphilochius, basically everyone accepted, this Timothy guy is not a bishop, he should be, he should be kicked out. We should get an actual bishop in Alexandria. So everyone agreed on that point, right? So I will say that Zechariah is also proof that Saint Simeon accepted Chalcedon, right? Because that everyone except for Amphilochius accepted Chalcedon, right? This is what Zechariah says. Now, if you look at the letters themselves, now these letters, there are 4 letters, 3 of them supposedly written by Saint Simeon. One of them is written about Saint Simeon. Now, these letters exist in a... There are 2 Monophysite florilegia in the 8th and 9th centuries, and they are parts of that florilegia. So, if you want more on this, this is Torrey's The Letters of Simeon the Stylite, right? And he basically argues these letters are most likely forgeries, and today they're accepted to be forgeries. So I'm going to talk about all 4 of the letters and give reasons the problem with these letters. First of all, as I said, these are very late fragments. Okay, we didn't have them until the 8th and 9th centuries. And one of the things, again, they accept the Orthodox narrative, that is that Saint Simeon was a recipient of the letter. But it is not as if Saint Simeon first accepted it and then rejected it. Saint Simeon claims, Pseudo Simeon claims, I never accepted the council. Okay, so in the first letter to Emperor Leo, he says that he is rejecting Chalcedon a second time, right? And he is complaining about the emperor's late response after Pseudo Simeon responded to his circulated letter denying Chalcedon. Now, this detail is very crucial in determining the fact that this is most likely a forgery. Why? Because Saint Simeon died in September 459. But the emperor's circulated letter was either written in late 457 or in 458, right? And to understand about like how letters operate, it's not normal to expect like an instant response from letters. Okay, when you wrote a letter, it will take time, right? It will go on a massive journey on wherever it's going. And we're talking about Saint Simeon. He's in the Middle East, and then the emperor who's in Constantinople. So there's quite a fair distance. It takes days, and once it even reaches, it takes days to kind of it doesn't mean that, oh, I read your letter, I'm going to respond immediately. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes there won't be a response for some time. So there's basically not enough time for pseudo Simeon if this is written by the actual Saint Simeon to say, I'm waiting on your response. You're taking too long to respond to me. Especially when the emperor is writing many letters to many different people, right? He's circulating the letters to many different people, and Saint Simeon is complaining that he hasn't responded to him. This doesn't really seem realistic. Second letter to Jacob of Kafra. He's in this letter to Jacob, he says, I never accepted Chalcedon, and I never accepted it, right? And he attributes one of the reasons why this is most likely a forgery is that the attribution is that he's Simeon, who stands upon the pillar near the village Telnesi. Now, the problem with this is that Saint Simeon he doesn't need to specify that, like, oh, I am the Simeon who sits upon the pillar here, as if there are multiple other Simeons around. He was in his life, he was a once in a lifetime kind of a person. Of course, afterwards there were a lot of stylites that imitated him, but Saint Simeon in his time was the unique man. He didn't need to specify himself in this direction. It's more likely that the forger stated this to make the people, like, to make it sure that the people who are reading it, basically people in the 8th and 9th centuries that he's trying to propagate this letter to, is, well, this is Simeon. This is the Saint Simeon, the style of this time. He's the one writing this letter, not the other Simeons. And then we have the third letter to John of Antioch. And in this letter, he tells John of Antioch to ally with Saint Cyril and to not delay going to Ephesus, which, I mean, this is basically clairvoyance, which, I mean, this is Saint Simeon. Of course he has clairvoyance, but it is basically saying, John of Antioch, don't be late to the council. So for those who don't know what this reference is to, the Council of Ephesus began because John of Antioch was late. So either this is stating that John of Antioch deliberately went late, which, first of all, there's no reason for that. If anything, he will want to be early to defend, to basically defend himself and to defend Nestorius at this time. But another reason is also because it's kind of a strange thing to know. And if this really was an act of clairvoyance, let's grant that for a second, you will expect this to be noted in his life, right? Like, people will say, wow, here's an instance of clairvoyance of, Saint Simeon. He told John of Antioch not to be late, but he was late because John of Antioch didn't listen to him. That didn't happen. Like, no one states that this was a miraculous event throughout his history. We see this first time in here. So it's quite interesting that we will see in this letter. And then we have letter 4. The letter of Alexander of Mabuk and Andrew of Samosata to John of Antioch and Theodore to Cyrus. So this is about Saint Simeon. And basically they're stating that, Simeon has opposed us and he's not one of us anymore. He's against us, basically. When you read the 4 letters in this way, this is a very convenient narrative that they all came out in the 8th and 9th centuries. We didn't have this before. No church history mentioned. Evagrius doesn't mention it. Zechariah of Mytilene doesn't mention it. None of these people mentioned it. We see this mentioned here, and it's just super convenient. We have this like massive narrative. Emperor Leo circulates the letters to him. He says, I never accepted Chalcedon. Where is your second letter? I'm waiting on your response. Then to another person, hey, I don't accept Chalcedon. I never accepted Chalcedon, unless anyone claims that I did, based on, the reports of Evagrius and the history of Orthodox historiography. So it's just the basic refutation. It's just too good to be true. The letter is just frankly too good to be true. And as Tori says, these are very clear evidences that these letters were late developments. So if you want me to give you like a very brief proof that Saint Simeon was Chalcedonian, look at Evagrius. Look at Evagrius's statement that he accepts it, and then look at Zechariah of Mytilene, who says only only Amphilochius rejected Chalcedon, implying that everyone else accepted Chalcedon. And again, both narratives, again, remember this, both narratives admit Saint Simeon received the letter. So when Zechariah is saying everyone, that includes Saint Simeon. If it doesn't include Saint Simeon, then Zechariah is disagreeing with the narrative proposed in these letters, which at this point, there's a contradiction within the Monophysite narrative. So it's very clear the Orthodox narrative is just much more consistent, even in light with Zechariah of Mytilene. Now, he cites this from Against Eunomius 4, saying this is from St. Basil. This is not from St. Basil. It's very notorious to know that Against Eunomius 4 and 5 were not written by St. Basil himself. It's debated who actually wrote it, but this is not written by St. Basil. And then we have this homily 23 of St. Proclus of Constantinople, where the statement, 2 natures in 1 nature is made, right? Now, this statement is made by a Syriac fragment, which he also cites from Ming, but this is actually from Cardinal Mai, right? But we will look at what the actual fragment says. Well, not actual fragment, but rather one of the earliest fragments, one of the earliest manuscripts, not fragments, but one of the earliest manuscripts, which is a Coptic manuscript, states that we do not divide the natures into 2 persons, but the 2 natures are 1 person. So this is the Coptic manuscript, right? Now, this is the Syriac manuscript that he is citing from, Vatican 369. Then there's a Vatican 368. The problem with these manuscripts is Vatican 368, which must be considered with Vatican 369, is mutilated on the very same part. So this is basically removed and deleted. And, Cardinal Mai states, this is most likely done by a Monophysite who was displeased with the Orthodox statement of St. Proclus. So it states a deliberate manipulation. And so Vatican 369, well, it seems like there is the same intention with Vatican 369, with manipulating the document. More importantly, the homily I cited is the Coptic manuscript, which predates the Syriac manuscripts by 2 centuries. Moreover, the citations of St. Ephraim of Antioch, Leonce of Byzantium, Leonce of Jerusalem, which are all 6th century figures, and then we also have John Maron, who has a very, working with more authentic files, which states that, there are 2 natures in Christ, that Christ is in 2 natures. They all agree with the 2 natures in 1 hypostasis statement, and they predate also the Syriac manuscript. So there's just frankly no good evidence of the authenticity of the Syriac fragment, especially in light of the fact that there's evidence of mutilation of another Syriac fragment, again, Vatican 368. So he cites the oration on the Dormition of Blessed Mary, attributed to St. Cyril of Jerusalem. Now, he cites this passage below, right? The attribution to Cyril is accepted by Bursch's Gospel and Waite's Evangelion 17, right? These are the shortened version of the works. Here's a question: what book is this from? Because it wasn't easy for me to find this book, but I did. It wasn't easy, I can tell you that much. This is from a very interesting book, but I will say more importantly, is this the full citation? Is he giving us the full statement here? Now, this book is from Morton Smith's Clement of Alexandria and the Secret Gospel of Mark. So for those who don't know who Morton Smith is, this is a guy who thinks that the apostle, Mark wrote his secret gospel, and he found the secret gospel, and then the evil Christians took it away, and he took a photograph of it, and so he has the evidence, and he wrote a whole book about it. Basically, he's a schizo. Now, first of all, Agon only cited the attribution that accepts this to, right? So this is the citation from the video. If you don't believe me, you can see the video for itself. Now, the full citation is what we see on the right. The attribution to Cyril is accepted by Birch, Waits, and doubted by Willhauer, and denied by James, Review of Hennecke, and Altaner in Patrologie. So this discourse is contested, but he only cited the part which they are accepted. And he states, supposing this to be false, the text will nevertheless come from southern Palestine and probably from the century after Cyril's death, right? So first of all, there's this detail, right? This is a disputed passage, and this is most likely a forgery, not written by St. Cyril of Jerusalem, because I don't think St. Cyril of Jerusalem will baptize someone in the name of the Virgin Mary. I think they will baptize them in the name of the Trinity, not in the name of the Virgin Mary. And if you think this is actually, he talks about the person taking the name Mary. No. because again, baptize him in the name of the Lady of us all, Saint Mary, whose day is this day. This is not a formulation that I've seen myself. So this is most likely not a work of Saint Cyril of Jerusalem. Now, we've gone to the third stage, blatant misrepresentation of the fathers. Let's start with Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. First of all, I'm really confused what he's trying to do with the statement. I mean, maybe I just don't understand, but in the Latin passage that he himself cites, he's condemning those who say that the Lord is made of one substance and another substance. Even the Quid Dominum quantum ex ipsis attinet, ex altera et altera substantia, ex altera, that's from. So he's basically saying that he condemns those who say that the word was formed from two substances. That will be a denial of from two natures. So I'm confused what he was doing with here. Then we have St. John Cassian, who he quotes, St. John Cassian saying, God and Jesus is in one and the same substance. And then you see the substance of Christ and God. The problem is, this is talking about the divine nature. First of all, you see in in the citation on the left, right? Therefore, understand without doubt, right? The citation below. The full citation shows that this is talking about divine nature, because he says, you see then that the judgment seat of God is the same as that of Christ. Yeah, because they have the same nature. He's talking about the divinity here. Then we have he cites Saint Ambrose talking about new work. This is a misunderstanding. So his argument is that, St. Ambrose is saying that there's a new work because of the incarnation. No, there's a new work because of the resurrection. He's talking about the resurrection being the new work of Christ, because the resurrection transformed the humanity of Christ. This is very common in patristic understanding of the resurrection. So this is not referring to a one composite energy or will of Christ. This is referring to a new operation of his resurrected humanity. Passages about St. Dionysius the Areopagite. So here on the top, he says that Christ came forth according to one nature. Oh, you see? He says one nature. Well, what is physin enos? We're going to look at that. Because one thing that we might have to ask ourselves, to anyone who knows Greek, physin enos, they don't agree with each other. Physin is feminine. Enos is not feminine. So enos is talking about something else. Then why is he only putting physin enos? Then we have letter 4 to Gaius, which we will also look at. The God incarnate, energy of God having become man. So, first of all, I put the more in context citation, and also the Greek passage, which states that advancing to the divided condition of ourselves without change from the essential one, and the basis for this translation is that, again, physis is a feminine word, but enos is the masculine neuter genitive of eis or hen, which both mean one, right? So in Greek, one has three genders. The masculine is heis, the neuter is hen, the feminine is mia, right? And this is why, right? Mia physis, because they agree with each other, one nature. But enos does not agree with nature, because enos, as I said, is masculine neuter genitive. So enos does not modify physis. So he's not stating that there's one nature. Rather, it modifies ektu, right? And it is genitive because said construction is also genitive. Ektu enos. That's what is going on here. So more idiomatically, the phrase prostomeriston imon analontos ektu kataphysin enos proionta means proceeding unchangeably from the one according to nature toward or divided condition. And then we have these passages here. Now, if you look at the actual, again, translation in terms of the supernatural nature of Jesus translation, right? What he's actually saying, first of all, in this passage, Saint Dionysius is basically saying Christ took the substance as man. He took the human nature. He says, we have received as a mystery, but we do not know in what manner, from virginal bloods by a different law beyond nature. So the humanity is supernatural. That's basically what he's saying. His humanity is supernatural. He was formed, and how with dry feet, having a bodily bulk and weight of matter. He marched upon the liquid and unstable substance. And so, with regard to all the other features of the superphysical physiology of Jesus, so basically, at least the way I understand, he's talking about the human nature becoming superphysical and physiological. But this is not specifically a statement of, again, Christ having overall one nature. He's talking about the human nature in this passage. So then we have Epistle 4. First of all, in this epistle, St. Dionysius talks about there being one, incarnate, new theandric nature. Not new theandric nature, new theandric will and energy, which St. Maximus and the Sixth Council accepts with an Orthodox interpretation. So it is not a specifically Monophysite understanding. However, if we are to look at the actual translation compared to the Monophysite passage in quotation that we see, which is Jesus, who is the firstborn among all, is connected to all men by substance, the same entirely became truly man. It's ... The actual translation states, how you ask is Jesus, who is beyond all, ranked essentially with all men. For not as author of man is here called man, but as being in absolute whole essence truly man. So Christ takes on the entire essence of humanity. He is in his whole human essence fully man. But he's not man only, neither super essential nor man only. So he is both super essential, that is divine, and also man, but truly man, he who is preeminently a lover of man, the super essential taking substance above man and after man from the substance of men. Now, I don't remember if they left translates from Agnes' video or from another source, but regardless, the actual translation states that Christ is fully man. He takes on full human essence. So even the very epistle where he teaches one theandric will, there is the persistence of the human human nature afterwards. So now let's get to the relevant passage, letter 4. New God, incarnate energy of God, having become man. Does this mean that St. Dionysius is a monothelite? No, it does not. If you look at On the Divine Names, chapter 2, paragraph 6, he explicitly states that the wills and energies are in some sense not communicated. Rather, what he's saying is that in his human work of God, right? So he says in regards to Christ, in his human work of God, for in these the Father and the Spirit in no respect communicated, right? So in his human activities, the Father and Spirit is not communicated to them. That is, it is the human work. It is the human activity. So he's confessing a human activity that the Father and the Spirit does not take part of. That's Dioenergist. Then he states, thus we too strive to unite and distinguish in the Word the things divine as the things divine themselves are united and distinguished. What he's stating here is that just like we are distinguishing the persons of the Trinity without dividing them, we are distinguishing things in the Word without dividing Christ into two persons. Then we have the work on the incarnation against Apollinarius, and he claims that this is we have to accept this as a work of Saint Athanasius because the Fifth Council cites this as a work of Saint Athanasius. No, we don't. We don't have that. Oh, not the Sixth Council cites it as a work of Saint Athanasius. No, we don't. Again, we are not beholden to the historical analysis of even like the council stating, okay, this work is from this person. The council can be wrong in stating who wrote this, but in receiving the writing, it is basically stating this writing is orthodox, right? This text, so to speak, this passage is orthodox, and the council receives it and puts it as an evidence against its opponent. So yes, people did believe that St. Athanasius was the author of it, but a really significant reason why we know St. Athanasius was not the author is because, again, the un-Athanasian use of hypostasis, which was explicitly used in the sense of particular, which is, again, St. Athanasius does not use hypostasis in any other sense other than essence, in any other sense other than ousia. So we know for sure Athanasius did not write this text. It was someone else. But it's quite amusing that he does cite this text, because if you actually read the text, the text is very Dyophysite. The author states that the Word became flesh, not that the Word might no longer be Word, but that the Word might be always Word, and at the same time the Word might have flesh, in which he accepted the passion and death in his human form. Now, in the very same work, the author states that form and nature are identical. So he's saying that he suffered death in his human nature. But it's not only just the author of this work. Various different other fathers like St. John Chrysostom, as I've shown in my video on the Bible proving two natures. This is, form is identical to nature. And then we have this statement, right, the word became superior to angels. It was not the word himself, the maker of the angels, that became their superior, as if he had ever been inferior, but that form of the servant. So it's the human nature that became superior to the angels, according to the author. And it became by nature God's own flesh. Right, the humanity of Christ became by nature God's own flesh, not as being coessential with Godhead of the Word. And then later he says, for that which is coessential, impassible, and incapable of death does not admit of union with what is coessential in regard to hypostasis, but in regard to nature. Whereas in regard to hypostasis, it exhibits its own perfection. So here, clear evidence of the unathanasian use of hypostasis. So clearly the author is not Athanasius, but the author is clearly Dyophysite. Now, he cites the influence of Theodore of Mopsuestia on Augustine's letter 187 by James W. Dewart, he argues that there is a line from Theodore of Mopsuestia to St. Augustine, to Prosper of Aquitaine, to Pope St. Leo. So basically, Theodore of Mopsuestia influenced Pope Leo in this regard, and he was influenced through St. Augustine, right? So basically, the argument is, in St. Augustine's letter 187, according to James W. Dewart, Augustine was influenced by Theodore of Mopsuestia, as it is seen in the way he uses Theodore's terminology. This article is actually refuted by Father John McKicken. Did Augustine's theology depend on Theodore of Mopsuestia? And also Robert Keach, the anti-Pelagian Christology of Augustine. So here, Father John McKicken gives a very simple argument and refutation. It says, Dewart proceeds in the second part of her thesis to tie the connecting lines between Augustine and the Antiochenes even more tightly by postulating a direct literary dependence of letter 187 on Theodore's De Incarnatione. To support this, she cites 7 instances of parallelism. In none of them can I find any synonymity of language, only the commonality of the theme of God's presence in the saints. At several instances of supposed parallel, Augustine is clearly elaborating his argument from the basis of biblical allusions which are not present in Theodore. If there had been a literary dependence, biblical paradigms might well have been omitted, but hardly added in the way they appear in Augustine's text, closely woven into the fabric of his argument. And the other argument he makes is that Dewart makes this bad argument that Theodore was circulated by the Latins, like there will be Latin works of Theodore, because St. Augustine didn't read Greek, he didn't know a lot of Greek, so he will not be able to read Theodore in Greek. He will have to, if he read Theodore, he will have to have read him in the Latin. The problem with this is Theodore's works were not really popular in Latin. The only evidence that we have of that she used this as an evidence. The problem with this evidence is that they only show that the circulation of his writings in the 6th century. It is by the defenders of the 3 chapters, right? It is not because they read Theodore beforehand. It was to defend the 3 chapters. So those are not evidences for Theodore of Mopsuestia's writings being, spread in Latin. There's frankly no evidence, as far as I can see, of St. Augustine somehow finding out about Theodore of Mopsuestia and reading him. Now, there's an interesting argument that they make in which they argue that, look, St. Augustine admits that he was actually influenced by Theodore because he uses a terminology from Theodore of Mopsuestia, namely the term man of the Lord. So, man of the Lord is not accepted at all in, Monophysite terminology, I will suppose. And they're using it, well, man of the Lord is a specifically Nestorian term, and Theodore uses it, and St. Augustine even goes and says, I regret using the term man of the Lord. I wish that I had not. Now, he doesn't cite the full passage because in the full passage he says, but there is an orthodox way to cite this passage according to some orthodox teachers. But anyways, the argument is, look, I read it in the writings of certain Catholic commentators on the sacred scriptures. Well, this seems to mean he must have read Theodore of Mopsuestia. Is that really the case? First, again, this is the fuller part. Later, in fact, I saw that it should not have been said, although it can be defended with some justification. So he says this can still be justified. So, did he really get this from Theodore of Mopsuestia? Is this really a specifically Nestorian terminology? Because if you look at the term man of the Lord, in Latin it's homo dominicus. In Greek, it's ho kyriakos anthropos. Let's look at St. Gregory of Nyssa. He says, the man of the Lord of the Savior cried out to his Father on the cross, saying, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. So we have St. Gregory of Nyssa using the term man of the Lord. Then we have St. Epiphanius of Cyprus. He says, he talks about the constitution of the man of the Lord, Kyriako Anthropou. In another instance, he says, Christ has suffered in the flesh, I say, in the man of the Lord himself, which the holy God Logos himself, who came from the heavens, formed. So Christ suffered in the man of the Lord. First of all, this is very explicitly Dyophysite, but even more than that, again, this statement is used by St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Epiphanius. If you want to read more on the use of Kyriakos Anthropos, because there's more, it is in Marcellus of Ancyra, apparently. It is arguably it is in St. Athanasius. It is arguably in St. Jerome. According to Rufinus of Aquila, it's in St. Jerome. So the term Kyriakos Anthropos or Homo Dominicus is not as rare as they will want you to think. So this is absolutely no evidence of Theodorian influence on St. Augustine. It's much more likely that St. Augustine got this from actual Orthodox writers that actually do use this term. Now, we have quotes that he uses from St. Hippolytus of Rome against Beron and Helix. One thing I would like to state, in my personal opinion, it feels like against Beron and Helix is too good to be true of a work. I am saying this when he thinks that it favors his view, but it absolutely doesn't, because this work is explicitly diotolite, it's explicitly dioenergist, and it's explicitly Dyophysite. And I could even go as far as to just like cite all of the fragments, because frankly, it is, as I said, too good to be true. Again, I don't know much about the authenticity of it. It does seem to be authentic according to some. According to some others, it does not seem to be authentic, but I haven't seen, when was this written, etc. But nevertheless, he cites this and he thinks that it favors his view. So let us see if it actually does. Now, in the text in the left, it states that there's one natural substance, right? This is basically what's implied by the text. But this is using the Latin translation. If you look at the Greek fragment, if you look at the Greek statement, the statement is not natural substance, it's natural existence, or hyparxin, right? Hyparxin is existence. So it's basically stating that the divine and human exist as one. That's hardly a one nature statement. But then, when we look at the full quote, what he did not cite, the following sentence, the following sentences, he says, showing himself thus, as both being in reality and as being understood to be one at the same time infinite God and finite man, having the nature of each in perfection with the same activity, that is to say, the same natural properties. And you can see the Greek passage below here, right? He has the essence, right? The essence of each perfectly, right? In their perfection with their energies and their natural properties. I mean, this is just classic Dyophysitism. This is just classic two-nature theology. Whence we know that their distinction abides always according to the nature of each and without conversion. Now remember, in the debate, he said there is no distinction of natures after the union. St. Hippolytus here is saying we know that their distinction abides always according to the nature of each. So on the natural level, there is a distinction. This is another passage that he quotes. I'm just going to quote the previous passage that gives the full context, because here, basically, it's just, the two energies operating as one, right, in their unique mode. Well, if you look at the previous passage, he explains how. For they did not perceive that it is impossible. So he's talking about his opponents, right, Beron and Helix. For they did not perceive that it is impossible for the energy of the divine nature to become the property of a being of a different nature apart from conversion. What does it mean here? So let me translate this very simply. If you have if the natural properties of an X nature become the natural properties of a Y nature, then there's a change of natures. What he's basically saying is that the properties of the divine nature cannot be the properties of another nature, including the human nature or any other nature. So he's basically saying that if there's a union of the natures, their properties remain in their respective natures, which again, he also denied. Yet he cites St. Hippolytus to support his argument. And then in the last sentence, in the last fragment, he says, Baron, therefore, since the case stands with him, and as I have already stated, confounding together in nature the deity and the humanity of Christ in a single energy, and again separating them in person, subverts the life, not knowing that the identical operation is indicative of the co-natural identity only of co-natural persons. What he's basically saying is that if you have the sameness of energy and the sameness of property, you have the sameness of nature. So if Christ is a single energy, you cannot have, you cannot even really have a single Christ. You will have two Christs. You will have a separation because they will be separated of the same nature. Basically, this is kind of the argument that he's going for. But simply put, the properties of divinity and humanity cannot be confused with one another, according to Saint Hippolytus, or rather, according to the author of Against Baron and Helix, right? Now, in the work of Saint Hippolytus, in his expository treatise against the Jews, he says, Christ prayed all this economically as man, being, however, true God. But, as I have already said, it was the form of the servant that spake and suffered these things. The form of the servant is the human nature. Now, last part, this is a short florilegium on Dyophysitism or two-nature theology in the Fathers. Let's look at St. John Cassian against Nestorius, Book 1, Chapter 6. He cites the confession of Leporius, who repents from his Pelagianism. And this is the confession, rejecting one substance, talking about two substances, the double substance, the twofold substance of the Lord. And we know, again, as I said, he said, God forbid, Leporius says this, and St. John Cassian says, this is the confession of the church. God forbid that we should imagine that the two natures being in a way, molded together should become one substance. For a mixture of this sort is destructive of both parts. So this is a very important statement. Mixture of this sort is destructive of both parts. So neither part should be destroyed, right? Both parts, therefore, should remain after the union. And this is stated, in his confession, which is, again, clearly Dyophysite. But if you want Dyophysitism in St. John Cassian, look no further than this statement. He says, most admirably does he, that is St. Paul, point not merely to him who was visible, but to him who was in what was visible, distinguishing the indweller from him in whom he dwelt, by pointing out the natures, not by denying the unity of persons. Again, naturarum, that's in the plural. So yes, maybe two is not there, but naturarum is a plural statement. So he's talking about two natures. And what is he doing? Distinguishing the indweller from him in whom he dwelt. And this is a popular biblical argument. Especially this is associated with Antiochian theologians, but really it's just a biblical application of God dwelling in the tabernacle. Just like how God dwelled in the tabernacle, God now dwells in his tabernacle, which is in his body. And so he says, we distinguish the dweller from what is dwelt, not because they are separate persons, but because they are distinct by nature. This is a distinction of natures after the union, because God is indwelling in something, in a nature that is established. So this is a two natures after the union quote. Then we have St. Ambrose, and this is quoted by the Third Ecumenical Council. He says, let us take heed, and by the Greek passage, of course, this was written in Latin, but the Greek passage is to record how the Greek, how the Greek translation was recorded. And he says, let us take heed to the distinction of the Godhead from the flesh. In each there speaks one and the same Son of God. For each nature is present in him. The Greek term is hekatera, right? Hekatera means each. It's basically the same as Uterque. So it considers each nature, as a single thing. Basically saying in each nature, right? En αυτοί, right? So in him speaks each nature. Now, if this is not convincing enough, each nature is indeed in Christ, but Christ is not in each nature, and this doesn't mean that there's a distinction of the natures after the union. If that is not enough, then the last passage, because he speaks in my nature, referring to ousia, how does he speak in our nature if that nature is not in him? Simple as that. So, again, this is again cited in the Third Ecumenical Council. Then we have another letter of St. Ambrose, who attacks the Apollinarians because they affirm one substance. This is repeated in another work, the Incarnationis Dominicae Sacramento, where he again attacks those who say the flesh of the Lord and his divinity became one nature. And in his letter 46, which is against the Apollinarians, again, he says Christ was in the form of a servant, in Latin erat in servi forma, but he was also in the glory of God the Father, in gloria Dei Patris. So Christ is in the form of a servant and in the glory of God. Also, Scripture tells us he is in the form of God. So he's in human nature, in divine nature, in two natures. As Chalcedon says, nevertheless, in the psalm, the Son has plainly called the Father Lord. They that looked upon me shake their heads. Help me, O Lord my God. For speaking in the form of a servant, he called him Lord, whom he knew to be his Father, though equal in the form of God, proclaiming himself to be a servant according to the substance of his flesh. Remember, as I quoted this letter, in this letter he states that form is nature, right? Form is the perfection of nature, according to Saint Ambrose. And then we have this statement, this longer statement, where he commentates again on Philippians. He says, what is the meaning of, now I'm talking about it. I didn't talk about it before. I'm talking about it now. But I talked about it in a different video. Now I'm repeating here. He says, what is the meaning of in the form of God, but in the fullness of the Godhead, in the expression of the divine perfection? Being therefore in the fullness of the Godhead, he emptied himself of it and received the fullness of human nature and perfection, so that in either form, in Uterque form, right, in each form, he might be perfect. Wherefore David also says, thou art fairer than the children of men. The Apollinarian is confuted. He has no refuge to turn to. He is caught in his own net. For he himself had said, he took upon him the form of a servant. He was not chosen to be a servant. I ask again, therefore, what is the meaning of in the form of God? He replies, in the nature of God, which he affirms. I inquire, what is the meaning of took upon him the form of a servant? Doubtless, as I have stated, the perfection of the nature and condition of man, that he might be in the likeness of man. And then he says, he was seen in the form of man. So Christ is in the form of God, in the form of man. Form means nature. He was seen in the form of God. He was seen in the form of man. He is seen in two forms. He is in two forms. It says you can't get in. He is in either form. He is in each form. He is in both forms. He is in two forms. This is what St. Ambrose is simply stating. Now let's move to St. Hilary of Poitiers. On the Trinity, Book 9. I have been compelled to dwell briefly on this, lest we shall forget our Lord Jesus Christ is being treated of as a person of each nature. This is the more appropriate translation. Since he who was abiding in the form of God took the form of a servant, in which he was obedient even unto death. The obedience of death has nothing to do with the form of God. So its obedience is only to the form of man, only to the human nature. This is explicitly, by the way, condemned in Severus, that you can't attribute things only to a specific nature. Well, here St. Hilary does exactly that. Just as the form of God is not inherent in the form of a servant, yet through the mystery of the gospel dispensation, the same person is in the form of a servant and in the form of God. Same person is in the form of a servant, in the form of God. Form is nature. He is in two natures. This is just Chalcedon all over again. Though it is not the same thing to take the form of a servant and to be abiding in the form of God. Nor could he who was abiding in the form of God take the form of a servant without emptying himself. Why? Because the combination of the two forms will be incongruous. So they cannot be one form. You can't get any clearer than in this passage. And then we have St. John Chrysostom in his De Consubstantiali. Now, I'm quite sure this is indeed an authentic work. We have, according to St. John Chrysostom scholar, this is a Voitsu. According to Voitsu, this is an authentic text. And here St. John Chrysostom, in commentating on the Lord's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, and this, he prefaced it as the heretic, right? So he's basically making an argument against his opponent that denies the consubstantiality of Christ with God and with man. He says, for the words indicate not only distress, but also two wills, one of the Son and one of the Father, opposed to one another. For the saying, not as I will, but as you, shows this. Yet they have never admitted this. Rather, while we say, I and the Father are one with respect to power, They claim that this is said with respect to will, asserting that the Father and the Son have one will. Now he says, if then the will of the Father and the Son is one, how does he say here, nevertheless not as I will, but as you will? For if this is said with respect to the divinity, a contradiction arises and many absurdities follow from it. But if it is said with respect to the flesh, the words make sense and no blame results. So basically stating that if when Christ saying not as I will, but as you will, if that is stated in his divine will, that doesn't make any sense because they have one will. But if it is stated in his human will, then the statement will make sense. And again, in the same work, he says, he leaves it by himself, stripped of his own activity, in order that by showing its weakness, he might confirm its nature. Then he says, for just as if he continually displayed what is human, this will have been taught of him. This will have been taught of him. So also, if he constantly performed what belongs to divinity, the doctrine of the dispensation will not have been believed. For this reason, he varies and interviews both words and deeds, so that he might give no occasion either to the disease and madness of Paul Samosata, nor to that of Marcion and Manichaeus. So what he's basically saying here, sometimes Christ acts only as God, sometimes he acts only as man, and sometimes he acts as both simultaneously, to basically state that the heresies that deny his divinity and the heresies that deny his humanity are both heretical. Again, this is distinguishing the sayings and applying them to the natures. I want to finalize my argument with a discussion on the letter 32 of St. Gregory of Nyssa. Now, this is, our opponents love to claim that this is a forgery. This is a forgery by Leontius, an evil forgery by Leontius of Jerusalem. So what I will do is I will demonstrate that this letter does have decent testament to its authenticity. Now, this is relevant because in this letter, St. Gregory of Nyssa says, Christ then, existing in two natures, right? So he states that Christ exists in two natures, bears in himself the unconfusable and indivisible distinction between the word and the ensouled flesh, through which the principle of the properties is preserved integrally. So, very clear Dyophysite statement, right? The properties, essential properties, are attached to their respective natures. Now, the main argument is manuscripts are late, and it's first attested by the notorious forger, Leontius of Jerusalem, who is very unreliable, and we can never trust him. And this letter is not popularly circulated. You don't see it everywhere, and this is a question mark. Why is it not stated? Why is it not circulated? Especially if this letter is right, you will expect this to be circulated even by the Dyophysites, but it is very rarely. So I would like to start with the manuscripts are late argument. This is not an argument because we have many manuscripts. We have many texts that we trust that have late manuscripts, like the Uterque. I think the earliest manuscript goes as far as back to the 10th century. And we really only found out about the Uterque in the 19th century, in an Orthodox mount, I think in Mount Athos. Like, that's the first time like people kind of discovered the Uterque. But now we know the Uterque is an actual document written by the apostles. So late manuscripts, it's not about the date of the manuscripts, it's about the quality of the manuscripts that matter. Second, about the notorious forger, Leontius. No scholar really considers him a notorious forger. Patrick Gray, in his introduction on Leontius of Jerusalem's against the Monophysites, rather states that the problem with Leontius is that he's very careless with his sources. He works with bad sources, and he pretty much works with anything that he can get his hands across, right? So it is true, he's very careless with sources. He's not very super reliable, but the argument is not dependent merely on Leontius, as I will show, and he is not the main source of the authenticity of the letter. In fact, it is much more likely that it is more independent. On the point about it not being popularly circulated, this is something that I will discuss later, but mainly, this is a private letter, and a private letter not being popularly circulated is actually very normal. But let us look at the history of attestations. So, in scholarship, we knew Leontius of Jerusalem, we knew St. John Damascus, and there's actually a difference between the attestations of St. John Damascus and Leontius of Jerusalem. So, they don't exactly take from the same source, but this letter existed only in the fragmentary form in the scholarship. And then we discover John Maron. Now, John Maron is a monothelite patriarch. He's, you have the Maronite sect in Roman Catholicism. He's basically Maronites. John Maron. He's the guy. He's basically the guy, right, of the Maronites. And John Maron was a monothelite, so he was not very well regarded. He was pretty much treated as someone hostile. But with John Maron, we find a large portion of the letter. So if we have access to the letter, it is thanks to John Maron. And he translated the letter to Syriac, right? Then we have the fact that this translation is not dependent on Leontius, because a large portion of the letter translated by Syriac was by him, and Leontius only has a fragment, right? Unlike John Maron actually probably had the entire letter. So that also indicates difference of sources. Now, moving on, we have Giovanni Mercati, who finds a 16th century Latin manuscript, and then he traces it to a 9th century Latin manuscript. And one interesting detail about the Latin manuscript is that it is clearly translated by someone who knows Greek quite well, because it is very carefully translated. It is completely aware of the Cappadocian terminology. It is aware of the terminological norms in translating it to Latin. There's a lot of statements, kind of like in parentheses, you could think, and renderings of the key Greek theological terms from Greek to Latin. So this is not just translated by anyone. This was translated by someone who knows the two languages and the tradition of the two languages like the back of his hand. The most likely candidate is Saint Dionysius Exiguus, who's the saint in the Romanian Patriarchate, who is one of the Scythian monks. He's basically the most likely candidate. One of the other reasons is because he already translated another work of Saint Gregory of Nyssa on the making of man, or on the creation of man. So Dionysius Exiguus is most likely the translator of this work. Now, if you move on to the private letter objection, it's not being circulated so popularly is really not surprising for a private letter. It's basically the norm. It will be strange if it was promulgated, actually, because first of all, private letters are private. They're not supposed to be spread around. They're just private letters sent between. So if it was spread around widely, all across the world, it will kind of make you ask, okay, either this letter is super popular or there's something going on around here. And another argument that I will also make is that if this was a forgery, last thing I will want is to forge a private letter with a foreign sender, because there's no other recipient, Philip. The letter is to the monk Philip. There's no other letter with the recipient monk Philip. You will basically want a recipient that is in Gregory's corpus. You don't have that. So there's a lot of reasons why a forgery is just very unlikely. But compared to other letters in the ancient Greek world, we actually have very decent attestation information about this letter. So, for example, Ad Grecos and Ad Eustatius, we know that these were written by Saint Gregory of Nyssa, but they are traced to a singular source in the 9th to 10th centuries. But no one doubts their authenticity. So that can't be compared to letter 32. I mean, if you don't want to count Leontius, you can count John Maron. And compared to Leontius's and his documents' unreliability, and this is the important point regarding John Maron, because again, it's not just Leontius is sloppy. His documents, his sources that he's working with is also clearly sloppy, right? It's not just he's the problem. He is working with really bad sources, right? In his area. And if he wants to, he can do decent scholarly work. This is why he's one of the people who argued against Apollinarian Forgeries, right? So he can do okay scholarship if he wants to, but it seems like he had access to horrible documents and just made use of anything that he could got and just threw everything until one of them could stick, right? That was basically his strategy. But no one in scholarship states that Leontius was deliberately forging documents. This is something that is not really claimed. This is just a claim. This is not something that is based on fact. This is not based on reality. But compared to the sloppy scholarship of Leontius, John Maron's scholarship, on the other hand, is very good, which indicates it's not just the person, it's also the documents he's working with. That is, he is operating with different sources. That is the point. This will mean not one, but two early independent attestations to the letter, which that alone will basically cement this being an authentic letter, because you don't see this usually with even authentic letters. But 2 independent attestations is really good for the ancient world, right? For those who don't know. Now, its attestations are in the fringes of the Roman world. It's not super widely circulated, as you will expect from a private letter. For example, Leontius cites it in Jerusalem. John Moron is in Syria. St. John Damascus is also Syria. So this is a very Middle Eastern, this letter is really in the Middle Eastern locale. You don't see it in Alexandria, so of course St. Cyril will know about this. You don't see it in Anatolia or any place like that. You see it Rome really only after. But you see it in the Middle East, which might suggest that this monk Philip, first of all, was someone who lived in Syria, and St. Gregory did send letters to Syria. So this is something that will not be abnormal. So perhaps this was a private letter that went to Syria, to Middle East, and just stayed here, and it was in the libraries of, certain monasteries in certain different places. And one of those places was Leontius, whose monastery or place recorded just about anything and didn't care for their authenticity. And then we had, stayed in St. John Damascus's. And then John Moron, came into getting this letter and translated himself. And it survived even the Islamic invasions, being in the hands of St. John Damascus. So if this was really intended as a forgery, we will expect this to be in the more central place, except this was mostly in Syria, right? Syria and Palestine. It didn't really get out of here. But all of this together, we know that Leontius and St. John Damascus attest to this letter. We have the larger letter, we have the letter itself, thanks to John Moron. Now, where did he get this from? We don't know, but John Moron got the letter and he translated this, and it corresponds with the fragmentary citations that we see in Leontius and John Damascus. So it's not as if someone just made something up from different sources. You can't really do that, right? You can't make something up from different sources. There's always going to be something that doesn't correspond. So that correspondence is there in the independent attestation. That's why it's really reliable. And then we have the Latin translation, probably from St. Dionysius Exiguus, but St. Dionysius predates Leontius of Jerusalem, which will mean that there was a Latin translation of this letter even before, Leontius of Jerusalem did what he did. So we have a Latin translation. We have the Greek source. We have a Syriac source. All of these details taken together, it seems like you will have to have very high standards to think that this letter was inauthentic and to think that this letter was a forgery. Now, I know Agon does not have those standards. Absolutely not. He does not have those kinds of standards, because I know that he thinks independent fragments, Arabic fragments, are legitimate. That's why he cites the statement from St. Felix of Rome. Where do we have that statement? Not from Eutychus' dossier. I checked the dossier myself. That quote is not in Eutychus' dossier. That quote is in an Arabic fragment. Where did we get an Arabic fragment? We don't know. I know he doesn't have regard for this because he thinks Saint Simeon denied Chalcedon based on 8th, 9th century fragment, two letters of 2 different collections that are also in Monophysite florilegium. Oh, how convenient. I know he uses Saint Severin of Kabbalah. Again, just a fragment. So, compared to all of these, I will say letter 32 of St. Gregory of Nyssa is very, very, very reliable compared to all of the various different evidences I have seen him use, which I haven't talked about this in the video for the sake of time. So all of these taken together, it is much more likely that St. Gregory of Nyssa is indeed the author of the letter to Philip. And as I said, Anna Silva's scholarship also points out, and also there's scholarship on John Moron, which talk about which talk about the scholarly process that he conducted in translating letters, making use of them in his text and in his florilegium, etc., etc. So there's more to it than one's eye can see if one merely believes in just claims. Now, this finalizes pretty much everything that I have to say. What is the conclusion, right? What can we conclude from this video? Well, I hope to show that union language, the language of 2 natures becoming one, is not specifically Monophysite, it's not specifically Dyophysite, it's not specifically one nature, does not refute orthodoxy. Stoic mixture is actually Dyophysite. It actually does refute one nature Christology. Twofold language is also Dyophysite. It also refutes one nature Christology. Outside of forgeries and unreliable fragments, fragments much less reliable than St. Gregory of Nyssa's letter 32, there is not a single evidence of explicit Miaphysite terminology in the Fathers prior to St. Cyril of Alexandria. And St. Cyril of Alexandria only starts using it because he thinks St. Athanasius used it. And people around him start using it more because they thought other fathers were using it. That's why Eutyches' dossier is so important, because he is the first one to connect, as I said, St. Gregory Thaumaturgus, St. Athanasius, and Pope St. Julius as kind of like the main authors of anti-Dyophysite, pro-Miaphysite terminology. But as we have seen, all of those were written by Apollinarius. And many of the fathers he appeals to, in fact, just expresses Dyophysite Christology, as we have seen. Many of them, there are many, many more that I could have added into this video, but will have been a lot of effort, and also will have been too long. This video will have been too long. Frankly, I think this video is already too long. So thank you for watching this. Make sure to like and share and subscribe. I will see all of you elsewhere in a different place. Goodbye.